I have been asked before, is there a universal diet that is healthiest for all humans? And the answer to this is unfortunately a yes and a no. So there are some things that do appear to be universally important for human health to incorporate into the diet. But outside of that, there is so much difference and nuance in what people need at different points in their life. I am such living proof of this. I have always been eating since I started eating more therapeutic diets, I have always existed within the overarching parameters that I would consider an ancestral human diet. However, what that has looked like has varied so much year to year. And I have been doing this kind of healing work for almost 8 years now. And so there has been a lot of shifts in that time, depending on what my body needed in that moment. So that's why I don't usually have a short answer to the question, what foods did you eat to heal? Because it's just been this amazing and complex and nuanced trajectory that I've gone through, and a lot of my clients experience the same thing. The diet they start on is not the diet they necessarily get into remission on, is not necessarily the diet that they eat long-term to maintain their remission. We honor the shifting needs of the body over time, and this is a window into the fact that ultimately humans are opportunists. That's part of what makes us such an incredible and dynamic species, and what has allowed us to migrate and live in every single climate all over this earth. There are people who traditionally live in the high desert, and there are people who live in the tropics, and there are people who live high in the mountains, and there are people who live on the tundras. And this is wonderful, and this is such a testament to humans being opportunistic and flexible and dynamic and creative, and I think it's something we should honor. So if anyone is trying to tell you that there is a one-size-fits-all with diet, I do not agree. However, I do think we have to pay attention to our evolution and our ancestry as humans. So let's look at what that is for a moment. So first of all, there is a lot of evidence that there was a shift from our ancestors Australopithecus, who looked a lot more like apes. They had definitely broken off from the lineage that became chimpanzees. They had broken off from there, and so they were walking upright, right? They were able to just use their hands, and they started making some crude tools to use with their hands, but they still had very, very small brains. And then we start shifting into the genus Homo erectus, which happened more like 2 million years ago. And these are, they were shorter than we are now, but they were more robust, and they had much, much bigger brains. And there's been a lot of debate in anthropology around what allowed this shift from these smaller brain hominids to these larger brain hominids and this Homo genus that we still exist in today. And so far, the best evidence we have is that this was around the time that we started domesticating fire. So we started being able to make and use fire strategically, and that we started getting more advancement in our tool use and our social strategy. So being able to maybe have more communication around how to hunt in groups, so that we could get more and more animal sources of foods. So we may have originally just started scavenging more meat, and then we started using fire to cook meat, and we started doing more advanced hunting techniques. And so what this all indicates is being able to get more and more meat into the diet, and also starting to extract bone marrow. So around this period in our history, we have evidence of smashed mammoth like femur bones, where we were smashing these giant bones of mammoths and pulling out the bone marrow to eat a large amount of animal fat as well, where we were probably scavenging and maybe doing some hunting of very small game before that. So it was very likely that being able to cook meat and hunt meat and eat more animal fat was a huge part of what allowed us to grow large brains as human. And so I stand by my conviction that including high-fat animal foods in the diet to at least some degree is going to be optimal for the vast majority, if not all, humans. This is probably a universal need that has existed for the last 2 million years for the Homo genus that we are a part of. So then we start looking at actual Homo sapiens. And Homo sapiens are the species that you and I are today. We have existed in this form with pretty much indistinguishable skeletons for probably around 300,000 years, which is quite a long time. And most of that probably until about 15,000 years ago. So 300,000 to 15,000 years ago. That's a big stretch. That's 285,000 years. Most of our history. We're living in an ice age. And so this means that we had access to very large mammals, and probably not a ton of plant foods, although certainly some. So there's evidence that humans did eat tubers, right? That we did eat a lot of root vegetables, maybe some berries, but not a lot of roughage, not a lot of like leaves and things like that. But certainly tubers, berries, probably honey, right? Things like that. But those kinds of things were limited because we lived in an ice age. There were probably long periods of time where we did not have access to many plant foods at all, and we relied primarily on the meat and fat of large animals. And I think this is why people who are the most ill often do better on a more meat-based diet. This is not universal, but I do see very often the sicker people are, the fewer plants they can have in their diet in order to recover fully. And I think that's because the vast majority of our evolutionary history was spent really eating this way. And so we kind of have to go back to the foods that our cells probably recognize the most in like a long time kind of perspective. So yeah, an ice age diet was what we have eaten for the majority of our history as humans. And we see the climate really start to shift between 16,000 and 12,000 years ago. And so we start to see evidence of game getting smaller as the large mammals died off, and people relying more and more on plant foods in their diet, and leaner game. So modern hunter-gatherers, and a lot of these cultures have been studied pretty extensively. So people like the Hadza are a really common example people would use because of how much they have been studied since like the 1960s by Western scientists who are trying to get a window into what a hunter-gatherer lifestyle looked like pre-farming, people who never adopted a farming lifestyle. It's very interesting, right? It's important to, get a look at these folks, but we have to remember, like, they are modern humans too. Sometimes people look at these cultures and they say, oh, like, this is what we must have lived like. And to a certain extent, yes. I mean, of course, if no one had adopted agriculture, if no one's adopted modern technology, then there probably are things about how they're living that are more ancestral, and we need to take that into account. We need to learn from that, absolutely. But at the same time, they're not living the same way they lived 20,000 years ago either, because their climate has changed, their context has changed, things have shifted. And so they're eating a modern hunter-gatherer diet, which does a lot of people really well. When people adopt a so-called paleo diet, right, where they're eating primarily, vegetables, tubers, meats, fruits, honey, nuts and seeds, things like this. Pretty much grain-free, legume-free. Grain and legume-free is the big thing. A lot of people do get healthier. They do feel better. And so we definitely can look at that and recognize that that is a good option for a lot of people, and probably how a lot of these hunter-gatherers have been eating for, at least probably the last 10,000, 15,000 years, or somewhat similar to it. Although even the Hadza now, because they've been kicked off their traditional land because of political issues, they are hunting even smaller game than they used to. So we have to take all of those political shifts into account too when we're looking at so-called indigenous diets. There's just a lot of nuance there to understanding it. So we can see as we're getting to agriculture. So agriculture started at the end of the last ice age around, 12,000 to 8,000 years ago, depending on the location around the world, but it probably was a necessity because of the food abundance going down in a lot of places that were highly populated before. So there was kind of a push towards really actively planting seeds and growing crops because those amounts of food were no longer naturally in that environment. And so it was kind of a really change your lifestyle or don't make it kind of situation. And so again, humans are brilliant. We are innovative. We make things work, even if they're not optimal. And it is true when you look at the skeletons of humans from 20,000 years ago versus those who adopted agriculture more like 8,000 years ago, we do see that people get shorter, their brains get smaller, there's more signs of infectious disease, and things like arthritis, like small signs of nutrient deficiencies and chronic diseases. We see signs of iron deficiency and vitamin C deficiency when we look at skeletons from places like ancient Egypt, who were really relying on things like wheat to maintain their diet. So we still don't have the rash of chronic illnesses that we see today in these cultures. Of course, these traditional agricultural-based societies, they are still doing a lot better than modern Western societies, but we do see a small decline in health. But that is still why that you sometimes will see people just cut the modern, processed foods out of their diet and their health will improve. Their blood sugar will go down, their blood pressure will go down. Some of the aches and pains they may be experiencing will reduce. So still can be a very positive shift. So with that brief description, you can see that throughout the history of humanity, we have eaten many different ways, and then also depending on where people have migrated, because around 75 to 50,000 years ago, we started migrating all over the world, and we ended up in every corner of this world in so many different ecosystems. And so we do see a wide variety of things that people can eat and still thrive and still be very healthy and very happy people. So let's talk about, though, the universals. The universals we see when we study people living all over the world who have not adopted the modern Western diet is that everyone eats a high amount of animal fat. And this is something that is wildly overlooked, especially by people doing so-called blue zone research. They are not nutritionists often doing this research. They are not actually watching people cook, because even when people are making so-called vegetarian meals in some of these cultures, they're cooking everything in animal fat, right? So even if they're cooking a starch like a bean or a plantain or cassava or something like that, they are cooking it all in like pork lard or chicken fat or butter or things like that. And so you're still getting the majority of their calories from animal fat. Even places in the tropics or farming-based societies where there may be less meat eaten. But then there's many cultures that eat a high amount of animal meats along with animal fats. So it does vary how much depending on the society, but it is universal to have a good amount in the diet and it be the primary substance that people are cooking their food in, their plant foods in. There's also consistently a high mineral intake, especially from spring water sources or seeking sea vegetables, right? So even if people are living inland, really engaging in trade routes to make sure that they are getting sea vegetables into their diet or some type of seafood, and also sourcing salt. So sometimes people travel incredibly long distances just to make sure that they have salt they can bring back to their communities. That is something that is highly prized all over the world in traditional societies. There's also always some type of plant food consumed. And so I probably angered a few vegetarians who have stumbled on this video with the animal fat comment, but I am going to upset some carnivores now. There is no society that we have documented that eats a 100% carnivore diet. This is a myth. We have never seen it. It's never been documented. It doesn't mean it's never existed. It's very possible. and very likely, like I said earlier, early in our evolutionary history, we ate a large amount of meat and maybe only seasonally some plants if we're talking about an ice age context. But as modern humans stand, as traditional cultures in the modern world stand, there is no fully carnivorous society. And that does not mean that we cannot use a carnivore diet for medical reasons, therapeutically, for a period of time. In fact, I often do this, and I think it's a really good approach for people who are the most compromised in their digestion or in their neurological health, or in their immune health. Sometimes people do best only eating meat for a period of time, as if it's like a baby food diet, right? Just like only meat, just be super gentle on your digestion for a period of time. But ideally, we do want to reintroduce plants as soon as we can, because they are universally eaten, probably for some of the fiber and prebiotics, probably for vitamin C, probably for certain glyconutrients, which are certain therapeutic sugars that we find in certain plant foods that actually help facilitate communication between our immune cells. So there's all of these nutrients that plants provide that meat doesn't always provide. So I do think humans are omnivorous, and when we look at the universals in human diets, that does corroborate that. That being said, very often those plant foods are prepared in specific ways in order to make them more digestible. So another human universal is that things are soaked, they're sprouted, they're cooked for long periods of time, or they're fermented. Fermenting food is another thing that is found universally in human societies, and that could be fermented plants, so things like sauerkraut. It could be fermented dairy, so things like kefir. It could be fermented meat or fermented fish, as in some of those Northern European traditions where they serve you fermented fish with your dinner. So things are always prepared in a way that allows for high probiotic content and high digestibility. Humans probably are still digestively adapted for an ice age diet. We have a very short digestive tract compared to other animals that eat a lot of plants. And so we have used our big brains and our technological skills of cooking and preparing and soaking and fermenting to help make sure that the plants we do eat that do provide us benefit, we are digesting properly. So these are things to consider when you are looking at what diet is going to be optimal for you. As long as they, at least in the long term, contain these basic parameters. So there's going to be people who, for example, do not initially tolerate fermented foods, or maybe initially do not tolerate any fats, animal fats in their diet, or maybe don't tolerate any plants in their diet. There are some people who are going to be so imbalanced and compromised that one of these aspects they're having trouble tolerating at this point. But at the same time, these are the goals for a long-term healing diet that is going to keep you free from the majority of chronic diseases, because these are the parameters that we see humans thrive on all over the world in all their beautiful diversity and innovation. So I hope that this was a helpful guide to put things in perspective.